that are working with UN Habitat to bring you this conference. So joining me as moderators for this session are Rong and Allan Cain. Rong is a member of the senior management of UN Habitat. He's based in Nairobi, Kenya, where he leads up the regional program. Allan is the director of the development workshop in Luanda, Angola, and is Canada's honorary consul to Angola, which is just a fancy name for ambassador. Allan, Rong, and I have all had the privilege of serving as vice presidents for ICCCASU and have been involved with the organization for the past 6 or 7 years. In this, the first of the keynote sessions for this conference, we'll be hearing from 3 speakers. As this is a synchronous session, all of our speakers are here online with us and will be presenting live. And each presenter will be speaking for about 25 minutes. Allan, Rong, and I will introduce each of them before they speak. And this will leave about 30 minutes for discussion at the end of this session. We very much encourage you to participate in this discussion. To pose a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We're not entirely sure what you as the audience are seeing, but questions should definitely be posted in the Q&A. And we can't see you, though you can see us. So the only way we'll know if you have a question is if you post it there. Well, without further ado, then I'd like to introduce the first of our presenters, Mr. David Miller. Mr. Miller is the former mayor of Canada's largest city, Toronto, and he's director of international diplomacy for the C40's Climate Leadership Group. David received a degree in economics from Harvard University and a law degree from the University of Toronto. Before running for public office in 1994, he was a partner at the Toronto firm of Heure. He served 3 terms as a Toronto City Councillor before being elected to mayor in 2003. He was re-elected for a second 4-year term in 2006, with a mandate of making Toronto a city of prosperity, opportunity, and livability for all residents. Following his term as mayor, Mr. Miller rejoined the firm of Heure, where he specialized in international business and sustainability, splitting his time between Toronto and New York, where he held a 3-year appointment as a Future of the Cities Global Fellow at the Polytechnic Institute of New York University, teaching courses on technological solutions to urban problems. And during this period, he also served as advisor on urban issues at the World Bank. In 2013, Mr. Miller was appointed president and CEO of WWF Canada, in other words, the Canadian division of the International World Wildlife Fund. In 2017, he left WWF Canada to become the North American director for the C40's Climate Coalition, where he's now director of international diplomacy. Mr. Miller's book, Solved: How the World's Great Cities Are Fixing the Climate Crisis, was published last fall. And this is also the title and theme of his talk today. So please join me in extending a very warm welcome to David Miller. David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Benjamin. I need somebody to release the screen sharing for me, according to the, I think it's working now. Here we go. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue à Toronto. I'm going to speak today about city-based climate action in all of its aspects, particularly the impact on equity and jobs. But I do want to say that this is in the context of a global pandemic that is far from over and is still significantly impacting people, our cities, our city governments, particularly in Africa. And in that context, I do want to acknowledge our C40 colleague, Mayor Jeff Makubo of Johannesburg, who died of COVID 2 weeks ago, ousted 2 members of Chiswani's city council. So at C40, we're very much have these colleagues and their families in our mind. So in that context, though, I'm going to make 2 broad points today under my talk, which I've titled While Nations Pledge, Cities Deliver, and I'll explain that title in a moment. First point I'm going to make is that climate risk is urgent. City actions and the voices of their mayors and leaders can help the world avoid dangerous climate change, in fact, are essential if we're going to do so. And secondly, that the pandemic has reinforced the need to address equity in all of its aspects, within cities, between north and south, and so forth, and also demonstrated the power of innovation in cities on these issues. And I will have a few examples to speak to that. So the title of my talk comes from a speech that the current council leader in Glasgow gave a few days ago at a C40 100 Days from COP event, in which she said, "While nations pledge, cities deliver." And I think that very much summarizes my philosophy and the approach that mayors of the world's major cities are taking to addressing equity, climate change, and all of this in the context of a COVID response. I don't think I need to remind anybody in this event of the significance of climate change and the severity, but we're certainly seeing last year and this year, despite the pandemic, focusing most of our attention, incredible impacts of climate. In fact, in Canada, a month ago, an entire small town burned to the ground because of a forest fire. And it's a forest fire of a type that's definitely connected to climate change because the weather has changed. It's hotter, drier for longer. And in fact, only a year ago, experts predicted exactly this kind of event to happen in Canada. So extremely worrying impacts of climate change. They're getting worse, more visible, wildfires, storms, and we see this in the news virtually every day. In this context, it's very important to understand and acknowledge the importance of the role of cities and urban areas. Today, for the very first time, in fact, for about the last 10 years, for the very first time in world history, the population of the world is predominantly urban. And our friends at UN Habitat would know the precise date a bit better than me, but in approximately 2008, 2009, for the first time in human history, the world became more urban than rural. And that trend is only continuing because of the growth of megacities in Africa, in India, China, and Latin America, much of which growth in the African, Latin American context in particular is in informal settlements. So what do we know about cities? Well, most of the world's population is in cities. Most of the world's economy is generated in cities. Most of the greenhouse gases are generated in cities, and there's some room to debate this figure. It might be as high as 75% of CO2 emissions, depending how you calculate them. This figure includes emissions from power plants, for example, if they're needed to power cities, even if they're outside the city and send the electricity into the city. About 2/3 of global energy is consumed in cities. And very importantly, and although I won't speak to it too much today from the perspective of resilience because there's only so much time, but the majority of urban expansion in developing countries is near hazard-prone areas. So as we see sea level rise and increasing frequency of storms, flooding, the urban expansion, particularly in informal settlements, is really in areas that are significantly of risk of multiple problems associated with climate change. In this context, mayors are demonstrating significant leadership in the fight against climate breakdown. Our organization, C40, is an organization of 97 of the world's largest cities, including approximately half of the cities in C40 are from the global south by intention, half in the global north. And the basic rules to belong to C40 are that the city must be showing climate leadership, the mayor personally must be showing climate leadership, and the city must have a plan to address climate change. And if you are active and leading, and if you are a city in a region of at least 3 million population, you can join C40. So it's most of the world's major cities. very significant global cities like Jakarta, like New York, like Paris, like Cape Town, and of course, like Toronto, Canada, are its members. In this context, and to place municipal, city-based climate action in context, it's important to understand what the science shows. And the science shows us that we need to be on a 1.5 degree pathway. That is, to hold overall increases in global temperature to no more than 1.5 degrees. In Paris 6 years ago, at COP21, the world agreed more or less to hold global temperature increase to 2 degrees with a higher ambition of 1.5. We now know that 1.5 was essential. It was not deemed, at least politically, to be essential at Paris. However, the Paris pledges only took us to about 2.6 to 3.2 degrees. Countries aren't even honoring those pledges. Current policies will mean a 3 to nearly 4 degree rise. And if there weren't any climate policies based on historical emissions as of 2020, and I'll come back to why this graph shows 2020 in a minute, we would be on a track to nearly 5 degrees of warming, which is catastrophic. You know, we see what is happening now with about 1 degree, really severe changes impacting nature, the environment, and people. 5 degrees would be catastrophic, but the world's on a path around 3, and that is exceptionally worrying. See from this graph what countries are on track. There's basically 2 that are role models. That contrasts to the actions of the world's major cities. So the C40 cities themselves, post-Paris, looked at the science and said, what do we need to do? And the science said what the major cities of the world need to do, in fact, what the world needs to do, in the global north at least, is peak emissions by 2020, on a path to more or less having them by 2030, to net zero by 2050. So we designed, in global south, the peaking can come a little bit later because it's such a smaller share, but essentially peak emissions by the end of 2020, on a path to having emissions by 2030, zero by 2050. So C40 cities agreed on a program to do that. It's called Deadline 2020. And in order to remain a member of the C40, every city has to have a climate plan to do exactly that. Its fair share of having by 2030 on a path to net zero by 2050. The good news is 54 of the C40 cities already have such plans. A few, particularly in Africa, have been delayed because of COVID and the inability of city governments to be able to solve COVID and do a climate plan at the same time, but those plans are coming. A significant number of C40 cities, including Toronto, have already peaked emissions, somewhere well over 40. And cities are therefore doing their share. Not only are C40 cities doing this, but through UNCCC sponsored Cities Race to Zero, in which C40 is taking a leadership role, we're taking the knowledge of how to create a climate plan that's this effective to at least 1,000 global cities to spread this action and ensure that cities well beyond the world's major cities are acting to do their share of climate change. In contrast to national governments who have made pledges, aren't even honoring the pledges, and are nowhere near being on track to a 1.5 degree trajectory. Well, how and why are they doing that, and how can they do that? Well, first of all, cities are doing it because they recognize the risks of climate and because the residents of cities are demanding change. They're able to do this because given that cities in the world generate the majority of greenhouse gas emissions, their actions actually make a significant impact. And in most cities, the areas that need to be addressed are how we generate energy, how we heat and cool our buildings, our transportation systems, including the way we build cities, to ensure that people can use active transportation and public transit, i.e. is the city dense or is it spread out like a city like Houston in the United States, for example, very spread out, and how we manage our waste. And in each of those areas, there are actions today happening in a city somewhere in the world, and I'll highlight Canadian, Chinese, and African cities for the most part today. But there are actions happening somewhere in a city in the world that, if replicated at scale over the next very short period of time across multiple cities, can help put the world on that very important first part of the trajectory to keep to 1.5 degrees, which is halving emissions by 2030. And that's important because these are actions using existing knowledge, existing technology, existing ways of thinking about urban design and cities that can be replicated at scale quickly and do not rely on new inventions. And if we are to keep overall temperature increase below 1.5 degrees, the action over the next few years is the most important and significant thing, rather than pledges to do something in the future, because in the future it will be too late. So electricity generation, all sorts of interesting examples of city-based activity on wind and solar. This happens in my home city of Toronto, mostly because I like this photograph, but Exhibition Place, which is a heavy user of electricity as an exhibition center, actually generates as much electricity on site as it uses through wind, solar, and a very sophisticated tri-generator. There's also very interesting programs in American cities like Los Angeles, which controls its own electricity generation. It will be zero carbon by 2035. Austin, Texas, used an interesting strategy. A few years ago, the city is booming, and it paid people to insulate their houses rather than building a new electricity plant, which would have been fired by coal or oil at the time. It's now doing a similar program to subsidize people to use solar on their houses to generate electricity and sell into the grid. And both of these subsidy programs were cheaper than building a plant. So lots of initiatives there. But I'm going to spend a bit more time on building, transportation, and waste because they're highly relevant to Canadian, Chinese, and African cities. Building sector is underappreciated, I think, when we speak about climate change. Certainly those of us who are involved in urban issues understand the importance of where buildings are located, their design, their architecture, and how we build them. But from a climate change perspective, it's important to know that in most cities, the single biggest sector of greenhouse gas emissions is how we heat and cool buildings. So not true everywhere. In a spread out, sprawl-based city, transportation might be the biggest sector. In many African cities, it's actually waste management because of informal landfills. But in most cities around the world, it's the most significant sector. And there's very significant work going on to create building codes that require net zero buildings, like in Vancouver, Canada, to address emissions from existing buildings and require they be dramatically reduced, like in New York City. And both Vancouver and New York are using their building energy efficiency laws to also create jobs at the same time. Vancouver, by working with the private sector suppliers to increase the energy efficiency of supplies. For example, helping make mass timber acceptable in large buildings, or helping smaller businesses that supply windows to manufacture them and change their manufacturing to be far more energy efficient. New York City is training young people from low-income neighborhoods to work on building energy efficiency as work ramps up to do energy retrofits on a huge number of New York commercial buildings. Significantly, progress is being made as well in China on ensuring that buildings are built to high energy efficient standards. Lots of work there to do, but lots of work happening in pilot cities. The Chinese government has a very interesting approach of allowing certain cities to pilot certain kinds of green programs and see what the results are, and then take that pilot national if it works. And there's good progress on building energy efficiency in China. And finally, led by Norway, there is an international movement around zero carbon construction as well. And I do have to put a plug in for, there's a Canadian company that some time ago invented a way to lower carbon in concrete, which helps on zero carbon in construction due to the prevalence, of course, of concrete in construction. And these kinds of inventions and initiatives will help quite significantly over time. So significant progress in buildings in Canada, in China in particular, and led by Norway and New York City. Transportation is critical, and transportation is critical not just because of the emissions from transportation, but of course, ensuring that our cities are built in ways that allow people to walk, cycle, use public transport, help create cities that demand less energy, and therefore generate far less greenhouse gas emissions. And we've seen certainly as a pandemic response, particularly in European cities and in Montreal, a real push to this idea of a 15-minute city, which really goes back to the thinking of Jane Jacobs, that people should be able to work, live, and get their recreation in a fairly short distance from where they live, so that you can meet all of your needs. And Jane Jacobs' argument was this is far more economically efficient. A restaurant in a neighborhood that has people living and working is more likely to be successful than one that is in a downtown where people come and leave and can really only serve a lunch trade and maybe dinner on Thursdays and Fridays. So very significant work in Barcelona, Paris, Montreal, and other cities on that concept. From the perspective of straight transportation, there are a couple of things that need to be done. First of all, ensure the cities allow for safe walking and cycling, build an excellent rapid transit backbone that's electrified, and ensure that all of our public transport is zero emissions. So Addis Ababa in Ethiopia has the first light rail network in a sub-Saharan country. Interestingly, from the point of view of Canadians, this network was planned, financed, and built all while certain cities in Canada were debating about where they should put their network. So I think we can learn a lesson, very significant lesson from Addis Ababa about how to plan and implement light rail. And one of the considerations I understand when they thought about the routing was, who are our passengers? Well, the passengers were likely to be women. And they thought about, where are the women going? How do we serve their needs? Very interesting and sophisticated way of looking at building a rapid transit network. And they also had to think about, this network will displace some of the informal sector, small buses. How do we ensure that the people involved in that industry remain employed and get good, decent work in the context of this new initiative? Of course, adding to this are bus rapid transit or bus lanes, either very important in the African context, but also important in North America. Ottawa, of course, has had bus rapid transit for a significant period of time. However, we need on those bus-based initiatives to ensure that the buses themselves are zero emission. And for this, we can look to Shenzhen in China, which has done an extraordinary job. All of its buses, over 16,000, are electric. All of its taxis are electric. And it's used that to drive the creation of the world's biggest electric bus manufacturing industry, a company called BYD, or Build Your Dreams, which creates directly and indirectly tens of thousands of jobs, all because of a strong and smart public policy message. In fact, now it's the result of the work of a collective of C40 cities. There are now about 66,000 electric buses on the streets of cities worldwide, with significant progress to come, particularly in Latin America, if we can solve some of the financing challenges, and we're hoping to do that on the road to COP26 in Glasgow. I'd like to make two final points and then a quick outline of how this works in the Canadian context and how all these points come together. The first point is the importance of waste management, particularly in Africa. Very significant program in Accra, including during COVID right now, to work with the informal waste sector to regularize the disposal of waste. And that's important because it captures the methane, which is a very bad greenhouse gas. But it's also important, and Accra's leadership, again, about regularizing jobs in the informal sector, so that simply by closing down informal landfills, you would close an entire informal economy, and the people working in that economy need to continue to work. And Accra is working very collaboratively with people resident in the informal settlements and organizations representing them in a C40 program right now to address those issues. So the final point I wanted to make is that mayors aren't elected just to address climate change. They're elected to build great cities where everybody is welcome. And in order to do that, climate action has to be equitable. And tried to highlight some examples in this presentation of where mayors and city governments are addressing climate with very specific thinking about equity. Other examples would include in Cape Town, work during COVID around food from an equitable perspective, and some work going on right now across 5 South African cities and the trade union movement to try to address the transition needed to move from coal to clean energy, which is extremely complicated in South Africa due to the prevalence of coal and the fact that there are good, well-paid jobs in the industry, but the conversation is a place to start. So how does this all work and why does it work? I'll give a quick example of Toronto and then wrap up. Toronto passed its first climate plan in 2007 called Changes in the Air. It had a whole range of actions, North America's largest transit expansion, multiple programs to address building energy efficiency in the private sector, in the public sector, in the not-for-profit sector like museums, and the provincial government assisted by closing a coal-fired plant. As a result of that plan and its successor, Toronto's greenhouse gas emissions as a geographic area are now 33% below what they were in 1990. So massive reductions are possible, and this is at a time that Toronto's been economically successful. But at the heart of the plan, the city addressed equity. So at the time, there was a program to address investment needed in low-income neighborhoods. It was called the Priority Investment Program, i.e., low-income neighborhoods were a priority for public investment so that young people in those neighborhoods in particular would have access to the same programs, the same opportunities, the same jobs as young people in more prosperous neighborhoods. At the same time, the city had a transit plan to build a network through light rail across the city. And if you look at these charts, the transit plan on the right and the priority neighborhoods on the left, you'll see that the transit lines actually connect the priority neighborhoods into the fabric of the city. And that's critically important. When we were consulting with the public about Transit City, the first 2 lines were Etobicoke Finch and Shepherd East. And I actually took a bus in the morning, very early in the morning, around 5:30 in the morning from Malvern, which is in the right hand of the slide as we look at it, and on to Shepherd East. And there was a woman who got on my bus in Malvern and was on Shepherd East. So I went over to say hello to her, and I said, "Where are you going?" And she said, "Work." And I said, "Where do you work?" And she said, "I work at Pearson Airport," which is where the Transit City button is, about 40 kilometers away. And I said, "How long does that take you?" And she said, "About 2 hours if I make my connections." And she said, "Mayor, why are you here?" And I said, "Well, we're talking to people about an LRT." She said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's a European-style tram that runs in the middle of the road, won't get stuck in rush hour traffic, will therefore be on time and much faster than the bus, which gets stuck in rush hour traffic, so the service is good." And she said, "That would really help me." And I said, "You've got a long day." And she said, "Mayor, that's only my morning job. In the afternoon, I work downtown as a cleaner." So she took about 4 hours a day to get to her 2 jobs. Now, if she had rapid transit, she might save as much as an hour a day, maybe more. And that might allow her the time to go back to school and upgrade her skills so she could have 1 job. It might allow her simply to be home with her family for dinner, or it might allow her to go to the public meetings about what kind of transit we need in our city and use her voice to influence the public discourse. So by creating a transportation plan that addresses transportation needs, climate change, invites growth and development in the city with an eye to equity, the City of Toronto actually created a plan that would improve dramatically people's lives and their ability not just to economically thrive, but to really be part of the decision-making in the city. That's true of all of the mayor's plans. I've highlighted some of them in my book. I think these plans are inspiring because they're real, they solve multiple challenges, and they give us answers to some of the most pressing public policy challenges of the time, particularly climate change. That's what I wanted to say today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to my colleagues' comments and the questions and answers. Thanks very much, and back to you, moderators.
Thank you so much, David. Excellent talk, and we look forward to questions you might want to post in the Q&A. Right now, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Allan Cain, who will introduce our next speaker. Over to you, Allan.
Thanks, Ben. I have the privilege of introducing Leilani Farha, who is our second keynote speaker. I met Leilani more than 20 years ago in Geneva while I was attending a meeting on forced displacement at the High Commission for Human Rights. Leilani at that time was the Women's Program Director at the Center on Housing and Housing Rights and Eviction. Leilani Farha is a lawyer by training and has worked to advance the rights of the poor and marginalized groups throughout her career. Between 2014 and 2020, she was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. Leilani is currently the Global Director of the Shift, an international movement to secure the right of housing. The Shift was launched in 2017 with the UN Office on UN Office of the High Commission on Human Rights and the United Cities and local governments. Leilani has always defended the principle that housing is a social good, not a commodity. She helped develop global human rights standards on the right to housing, including through her various thematic reports, the Rapporteur for Housing, and she produced the first UN guidelines for the implementation of the right to housing. She's also a central character in an award-winning documentary film called Push, regarding financialization of housing, and I hope we can share the link to film Push on our to our participants. So thanks. Over to Leilani.
Thank you so much, Allan, for that introduction, and ICCCASU for including me in this really interesting conversation. I actually wish, and maybe this will be the next one, that David and I could have a conversation about the relationship between the climate crisis and his work and the global housing crisis and my work, because there's so much overlap and so much to be discussed there. But that's for next time. So for a few years now, I have been fixated on two numbers, 1.8 billion and 220 trillion. So in the days when I traveled before the pandemic, I would go to cities around the world, in every region around the world, and I would notice two things. First, I would look up and I'd often see cranes on the horizon, shiny, fancy new buildings going up. And then I would hear about and see neighborhoods with beautiful homes that were owned but empty. Lights off, nobody home. And at the same time, I would visit people living on the pavements, on the sidewalks, in parks, on toxic waste dumps, living in homelessness or in informal settlements, but in either case lacking access to water, sanitation, electricity, paved roads, etc. Now, this was true in London, England, and Lagos, Nigeria. I've seen it in Vancouver and I've seen it in Cairo. I've seen it in Lisbon and I've seen it in Mumbai. What I've become interested in for several years now is the gap between those on the sidewalks and those cranes in the sky, that gap, the visual manifestation of the gross inequality that we know plagues so many cities on the planet. The gap between the 1.8 billion people, excuse me, living in grossly inadequate housing and homelessness, who cannot afford a decent, adequate place to live, and those with massive amounts of wealth using housing and home to hide it, to leverage it, and to grow it. So much so that the global value of residential real estate is now more than 220 trillion US dollars, making residential real estate the biggest business in the world, bigger than pharmaceuticals, bigger than tobacco. And just so you have a sense of $220 trillion, which, as Professor Saskia Sassen says, exits the domain of money. If you took the GDPs of every country around the world and added them all up and then doubled them, you still wouldn't reach 220 trillion US dollars. So the question, of course, is, how did we get to this place that I call a global housing crisis, where housing is unaffordable for most people in most cities, and where housing security is used by the wealthy and afforded to the wealthy? How have we gotten to a place where governments criminalize those who try to eke out an existence, who are just trying to survive, for example, by creating informal settlements on vacant lands, often so that they can provide services to other city dwellers and make sure cities run how we expect them to? Just this morning, I woke up to news of an incredibly regressive, unlawful occupation bylaw that the municipality of the city of Cape Town is considering, cutting off basic services to certain informal settlements, effectively evicting residents and corralling them into only sanctioned areas. How has it become the reality that the richer a nation or a region or a city is, the more likely you are to see growing homelessness and housing precarity. The richest country in the world, the US, has more than 500,000 people living in homelessness. And that doesn't account for all of the people living in housing unaffordability or housing precarity. 25% of the homeless population in the US lives in California. California has the 5th largest GDP in the world. While forced evictions, homelessness, grossly inadequate housing conditions have existed in cities around the world for a very long time, what is remarkable is its permanency despite the world's ever increasing wealth, at least for some, and the way that this is rooted in housing itself. And I'll just remind you that during the pandemic, a new billionaire was born every 17 hours. And at the same time, the World Bank says that they expect a new 150 million people living in poverty. A new 150 million people living in poverty. And you can imagine what their housing conditions will look like. And you can imagine where these billionaires are deriving their wealth. I argue that supported and buoyed by neoliberalism, this reality of inequality based in housing has really emerged ironically since the global financial crisis. It was at that time that the big financial actors, private equity firms, pension funds, and other investors realized they could create new financial instruments and make a whole lot of money by using housing as security. So for example, Blackstone, one of the biggest private equity firms in the world, and certainly the largest with respect to residential real estate, went on a shopping spree. They purchased something like 45,000 homes like that, one transaction. What they were buying were distressed assets. That is, they bought off the misery of people. They bought off the misery of other people. It was where owners had foreclosed on mortgages because of predatory lending. And suddenly Blackstone became the largest single landlord in the United States. Then they looked across the water to Europe and started buying social housing, particularly, for example, in Spain. And they have created the dominant model that is now used in residential real estate across the world. And that is the financialization of housing. It is the buying up of assets and using that to leverage more capital. They buy any asset that they think they can squeeze more profits from, or they can leverage more capital off of. Housing becomes simply a financial instrument. And the impact of this has been to directly undermine two central tenets of the right to housing: housing affordability and security of tenure. The business model associated with the financial of housing is one that requires rent to continuously increase and that uses eviction as a method of doing so. You move out low-income tenants and you move in those who can pay more. It's for that reason that when I visit California and I go under a highway, I meet people living in tents who just a few months ago were living in an apartment that they could afford. We have to remember, every homeless person used to have a home. Now, I want to be clear, we shouldn't confuse this as a northern-only phenomenon. Evidence shows that housing markets in developing economies have been targeted by domestic and international investors as well, and their economies are being structured and primed to eventually facilitate the entry of these big financial actors into their markets. For example, many states that are suffering a faltering economy establish as a remedy mortgage-based housing systems. So they dress it up to make it seem like what they're doing is trying to address a housing problem that they might have. But in fact, the mortgage-based housing system is used to save the economy or grow their economy. Mortgage-backed home ownership schemes of this sort very rarely, and I witnessed this in Egypt, for example, in Cairo, these mortgage-based systems very rarely actually benefit those most in need, the folks living in informal settlements and the folks who are living in homelessness. And so we can understand that that type of activity suggests housing is being used as a financial mechanism to establish financial market logics rather than to actually address housing need. And I think China also offers an interesting example where the drive for property taxes and profits has led to skyscrapers in the mega cities that are emerging in China, and huge profits for developers, huge political power for the developers at the expense of whom? Migrants who've been displaced from their agricultural lands that are no longer viable and who are living in these city villages where they lack security of tenure. So basically, it seems to me that in emerging economies, or in peripheral economies, as some people call them, financialization occurs whenever or wherever the conditions are ripe. Economies that have reached a certain level of financial development with low interest rates, mortgage-based housing systems, which allows for securitization, stable financial lenders, cheap debt or assets on the market, and a reason to believe those assets will increase in value over a relatively short period of time. And I will add to that, what makes these conditions also ripe are weak tenant protections. Of course, even in places where the financialization of housing has not yet taken hold, I think low-income, informal, and indigenous communities in developing economies have experienced firsthand the power of financial corporations to appropriate land and real estate and to generate vast disparities in wealth by treating housing and land as commodities. So beyond the damage done to adequate, affordable housing, I want to also emphasize that the actors, the private equity firms, pension funds, international financial institutions, real estate developers, also, not only are they gaining wealth at the expense of poor and low-income households, they have a firm seat at the political table. They are often government advisors. They provide money to political campaigns. I have seen a significant impact of these actors anytime interesting progressive legislation is put forward. They can use their political might and their resources to squelch and squash tenant movements or the rise of interesting legislation. So what do we do about this rather bleak situation? That's where human rights come in. And I think human rights are transformational and have the potential to be transformational. I think they offer the best challenge to the global, offer the best answer to the global housing crisis, and they can set us on the right track. First of all, human rights, if you don't know anything about human rights, know this. Human rights are really about accountability. I actually often refer to human rights as an accountability framework. Since the advent of neoliberalism in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, late 70s, 80s, and 90s, governments have basically ceded housing to the private sector. And the private sector has rarely been regulated and certainly has not been held accountable with respect to housing. That's how we've ended up with this global housing crisis. Governments around the world, and it is true, this is national governments, often without consulting with cities, national governments around the world have ratified international human rights law. They've made political commitments, the Sustainable Development Goals, and those commitments, legal and political, are to ensure adequate, affordable housing to those in need. Under international human rights law, it is very clear that who is accountable to whom? Governments are accountable to the people. And so if we invoke a human rights framework, we can demand that governments step back into the housing arena in a meaningful way and uphold human rights standards. Human rights also recognize, and I think this is a complete game changer if we can get governments to get their head around it. Human rights recognize that those living in homelessness and inadequate housing and housing precarity are in fact rights holders. So they're not criminals, they're not encroachers, they're not unreasonably demanding. Those living in informal settlements and homeless encampments and tenants aren't just to be viewed as people experiencing rights deprivations. We have to view them as rights holders. That then allows us to understand the tent on the sidewalk, not as a criminal act, but rather as a human rights claim. The same with informal settlements. The rise of informal settlements is not about encroaching and criminality. Those are human rights claims to housing, to health, to life itself. That means it elevates issues like homelessness out of the realm of charity and the beneficence of governments to a new place. The other thing about human rights is I actually think it is simply an appropriate response. And the reason I say that is if you look at the global housing crisis and the conditions in which people are living. Obviously, if you're living in homelessness or an informal settlement, or even in housing precarity where you're fearing eviction because your rent is going up and you can't afford the rent, all of those conditions challenge dignity. All of those conditions challenge even one's ability to survive, to live. Those are human rights concerns. And in my opinion, when you have a human rights concern, the appropriate response is a human rights response. And we understand that in other areas, in civil and political areas. For example, deprivation of one's ability to participate in democratic systems has led to constitutional rights to vote, for example. And so it was understood how important it is to be able to participate in democracies. And so we responded to that as society by creating constitutional norms that enable voting rights for everyone. So I'm suggesting the same. When we see an assault on dignity and human life, then the response should be a human rights response. And lastly, I'll say about the value of the human rights approach is that human rights, in their essence, address the structural causes of rights deprivations. Human rights are used to understand the impact of laws, policies, and social structures, and human rights are used to reimagine those. And this is super important where housing is concerned in light of the role that housing plays in domestic economies. It's very much part of the structures of our society and the structure of our economy. And human rights allows us to analyze the problems with those structures. Okay, so pretty bleak picture all around. 1.8 billion people suffering housing disadvantage and deprivation. People living in housing precarity. There isn't a city on the planet that's affordable to most of the population. Where's the inspiration? From where do we draw the inspiration? And I have to say, like David, I find a lot of inspiration at city level, but not exclusively at city level. So I thought I would just provide you with a few examples of some rights-based approaches that are happening, that are challenging the uber commodification of housing, and that are embracing the idea of housing as home, housing as a place of dignity, that are embracing the idea that housing must be affordable and it must be adequate. Let's start where I'm based here in Canada. A couple of years ago, Canada adopted legislation for the first time, acknowledging as the housing policy of Canada that the right to adequate housing is a fundamental human right. And they have established, or are in the midst of establishing, a federal housing advocate and a council as a monitoring and accountability mechanism. This is a huge 360 for Canada, or 180, I should say, for Canada. Canada has long denied that housing is a human right. In international circles, they've pushed very hard against it. In domestic jurisprudence, they've tried to push hard against that. So this is a real opening in this country. At city level, Montreal, of course, not surprising, a bit of a leader, has, for example, a new bylaw, very newly minted, requiring, they call it the 2020 bylaw, requiring that where new buildings are being put up, 20% must be social housing, 20% must be deeply affordable, and 20% must be family or larger units to accommodate larger families. And where a developer can't abide by the 2020, they have to pay a fine that goes into a fund that then goes right back into affordable housing. Pretty innovative. Advocates in Cape Town, South Africa, have been successful recently in preventing the sale of centrally located public lands to a private developer, and the lands will now be used as social housing for Black South Africans. Very important to address racial segregation within that city, where Black South Africans continue to reside on the peripheries and don't have access to some of the best city center lands. Going back to David's comments around the 15-minute city and all of those Black South Africans providing services for the city, but living on the periphery. So this win in Cape Town was super important. Barcelona is a real leader in terms of bringing the right to housing to the local level. They have required that vacant homes, for example, recently during the pandemic, that vacant homes be made available for the city to lease as affordable housing for a duration, for a certain duration of time. And where the owners of those vacant homes refuse, Barcelona has brought out a stick and said that they will expropriate those units. Denmark at national level has adopted a law that which is known as the Blackstone Law, which I just love. And it prevents rents from being raised for 5 years on new acquisitions and apartments that are being renovated. So that's a way of keeping the big financial actors out, because when they purchase, what they want to do is do modest renovations and then jack up those rents. And so the government of Denmark has said, you know what, you're welcome into our country, come on in, but you cannot raise rents for 5 years. And that has put quite a chill on investor activity in that city. In Buenos Aires, in 2021, this is the city of Buenos Aires passed a one-time wealth tax, a portion of the revenues from which will be directed toward affordable housing and upgrading of informal settlements. There's a real crisis in Buenos Aires around this. And they also have imposed, or are going to impose, a solidarity tax on foreign purchases of property. And again, a portion of the revenues will be invested in low-income neighborhoods and in social housing. Chile is moving toward including the right to housing in its constitutional reforms, which is super important. And I'll end with far-flung from me, New Zealand, excuse me, where the Human Rights Commission is really pushing for a human rights-based housing strategy and legislation to accompany it. So you can see, excuse me, that there is growing momentum. It is clearer now, I think, than ever because of the pandemic, that housing conditions are a symptom of inequality and that housing itself is a driver of inequality. I think COVID has exposed very clearly the relationship between housing and life itself, adequate housing and life itself. But as I said, there is this growing movement. Whether it can be sustained, I hope so. And as I called my speech, I just keep thinking what a wonderful place your city would be if the housing crisis were taken seriously and addressed using a human rights frame. I look forward to the question and answer period. Thank you so much for listening. And thanks also to David for his excellent comments, which I enjoyed. And again, I reiterate, we need to continue to be in conversation.
Thanks so much, Leilani. That's fantastic. Allan, did you want to thank Leilani?
Yes, Leilani, thank you very much. What I would like to do actually is, if this can be managed, is to invite you at the same time tomorrow. Ben and I are doing a panel on affordable housing, where we've invited Casey Rust and Claudia Rosbach and others to present from Africa, Latin America, and China on an affordable housing practice. I hope you can attend, and we'll find a way of sending you a link to that. Thanks.
I should also pick up on Leilani's comment about Montreal doing things a little bit better. On Friday, Mario Polez from Montreal will be talking a little bit about, and Vikram Bhatt too, both keynote speakers talking a little bit about the Montreal experience. So we look forward to that as well. So now we'll go over to Ron Young, who will introduce the third and final speaker from this session. Ron?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben. It is also my great pleasure and privilege to join you and Allan to moderate this session. As mentioned by Ben, my name is Rong Yang, currently is the officer in charge of the Regional Program Division of UN Habitat, as well as the focal point of UN Habitat with China. So today I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, Oumar Sylla, who is the regional representative UN Habitat Regional Office for Africa. Oumar has been working for UN Habitat for many years, and specifically leading the global land tool networks. Since the January 2020, he was appointed as the regional representative of Regional Office for Africa as a ROAF. Currently, he's leading ROAF for promoting the implementation of SDG in African countries, and as well as engage African countries in the implementation of SDG and New Urban Agenda. Over the past years, he's also provided a great support for ICCCASU since the first session of ICCCASU took place. Today, his keynote speech title is Building COVID-19 Resilient Cities in Africa, which mainly which will focus on economic impact, social inequalities, building capacities, developing urban resilient plan, as well as explore collaboration for long-term recovery for African cities. Now, please join me to welcome Oumar to deliver his speech. Oumar, Floor is
Thank you
yours.
very much. Thank you very much, Yang, for this great presentation. So let me upload my presentation while people are speaking. Okay. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Right, let me put it. Again, thank you very much to the organizers of this symposium. I know a lot of work has gone, to get it done. And we are happy even virtually to get together and to discuss, this issue of post-pandemic and related matter. And I think Africa is much interested, in this conversation. And as mentioned by Leilani, I think this issue of inequality is much higher than before in Africa. And the question we are asking ourselves is, what trajectory should we take, toward this recovery from this COVID pandemic? Of course, we know that Africa has not reached the level of casualty we see in other countries, but socially speaking, environmentally and economically speaking, I think there's quite, a huge gap that had been deepened by this COVID-19. So the whole question today is, what paradigm should we establish to get new direction? Because we have been doing things, in a certain manner, and I don't think that those has worked out very well. And COVID has demonstrated that we have a lot of failure on the way that we see our cities, on the way that we manage and plan our cities, and which require a new thinking. I think the purpose of this presentation is really this provocative, on the paradigm and building on the work that UN Habitat has done in many countries in Africa, but also globally speaking, on informing the discussion on post-recovery. What could be the different element now we need to take into consideration in terms of reconstructing the concept of our cities in Africa. And the mayor of Toronto has spoke the issue of climate change, which is an exaggerated element of the vulnerability of cities in Africa. So my presentation will be articulating around 3 points. First point, just taking stock on the vulnerability and the precarious situation of cities in Africa. And I think COVID-19 is just another layer of complexities coming into. But from there, we interrogate, those approaches that have been put in place so many cities in Africa in terms of response early age, in this COVID. And lastly, to see now what are key recommendations as a takeaway to make sure at least we can put ourselves in a good trajectory in terms of looking into the long-term recovery process. So before I go to the business, allow me to pay tribute to this guy. You all know Mr. Allan Badiane. I think he's going to be tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, 1 year he passed away. He's someone who invested on this ICCCASU, and he believed on urbanization as factors of a factor of economic transformation. Globally speaking, it was not only for Africa. I think he dedicated his time and he's thinking in the whole concept of urbanization, globally speaking. And today, I think I'm happy that people are talking about him, and he deserves again this acknowledgement. And thanks, Allan, for your hard work on putting forward, the interests of urban dwellers and poor communities, in front of the agenda. So just some figures, I think these are all known, on the impact of COVID in Africa, globally speaking. So of course, city has been the forefront of this pandemic and most affected. And we see that is mostly urban crisis, this COVID-19. But at the same time, Africa is going into third wave of infection, which is really worrying because many countries are now seeing a level of casualty increasing. And for us, today we are talking about 4.7 million of infection in Africa, which is quite, a high number. In terms of export, of course, we see already the drop of export. Even 2 days back, I've been inquiring, the shipment of container from China to Africa. The price has doubled or even tripled, which means that this is a factor, of this crisis that export is going through. And this is unfortunate for those countries who rely on export for their economy, and also those who are relying on this the transfrontier, business. Million falling extreme poverty, of course, we see decrease of revenue and loss of millions of jobs in the context of Africa. That's normal that we see this poverty increasing, and how many people now are getting out of the, in the street to claim access to food, to energy, and to basic needs, which means that this crisis may have some security and also some political impact, as we saw it in Senegal not a long time ago, recently in South Africa, and others countries may be in the same radar in terms of precarious situation of communities, especially as mentioned by Leilani. We have 56% of population in sub-Saharan Africa living in informal settlement without access to water, sanitation, and they lost their job because of the crisis, and still the pandemic is hitting. So in terms of gross domestic product, of course, we see a decrease in many countries in Africa, which is diminishing the capacity and the ability of the state to assist in terms of fiscal package, but also in terms of giving, a security social blanket to communities. So now, what is the connection we want to do between the trend of urbanization in Africa and the spread of COVID? I think there's a lot of concern at the beginning of this COVID-19 about Africa. People were saying, even including the Secretary General of the United Nations, Africa is exposed because we have huge density of population. We have a lot of informality. We have a lot of displaced people in Africa. So then I think there's a high level of risk for Africa of getting death on the street and others. Luckily, this did not happen. But something is right on this analysis, because the way we manage our cities, the way that we see, congestion of population in many big cities in Africa give impression that, the way our urbanization is more conducive to disaster and spread of the infection. And I think we hear some figures from the mayors of Toronto on the rapid urbanization, globally speaking. But let's deep dive a bit in Africa to see the trend, because Africa, we know that is less urbanized, globally speaking. But right now, the fastest rate of urbanization is found in Africa, which means that the trend is too high and too speedy. And we can find ourselves, reaching this, what we call this urban transition in Africa by 2040, with 1 billion people living in cities. And today, as you may see it, even the emerging secondary cities in Africa with plus to 300,000 inhabitants or less, which is another factors as well that we need to take into consideration in the process of looking into long-term recovery, because those cities at the same time, they constitute challenges, but also we see an opportunity for those growing cities in terms of territorial balance, but also in terms of giving opportunity to develop new hubs of economic development in those countries, to diversify revenue, but at the same time to diversify, if you want, economic activities. So that's why I think, of course, on this presentation, I will focus on those challenges, but we should see, as has been highlighted by the report published by UN Habitat, this is an opportunity for Africa to leverage the value of urbanization and to sustain our production system based on well-managed cities and well-planned cities. So you see this figure is not really something new. We all exposed to this rapid trend of urbanization. But what is important when it comes to COVID-19 is readiness and also preparedness of those cities to face a catastrophe, including climate change, disaster, disease, and others, not only talking about COVID-19. So I think we discussed already the level of informality in Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, 52% live in informal settlement, which is quite a big number. In Kenya, we are talking about 56% of population living in informal settlement, huge number. And yet we have a lot of factors that will contribute further to increase the level of informality. We see climate change. I think we talk about it. Look at what happened in Madagascar with the people fleeing this drought area to come to Antananarivo to look for food, to look for shelter. This is very worrying. In the Sahel region as well, we have a number of people being displaced by extremism, by violence. So I think we need to take into consideration those factors as well related to climate change and peace and security that can trigger more population coming to cities to increase the number of people living in informal settlement. So I think there's a reflection going on, but what is missing is a clear articulation between territorial development, urban development, and this phenomenon of displacement from climate change and from also conflict in Africa. The issue of mobility and density, I think at the beginning, I think people was perceiving this element of density as a factor that can contribute or even enable, if you want, the spread of the disease of COVID. I know there's a lot of controversy on the connection between density and also between spread of the COVID-19. Of course, there's some camp saying that density is contributing to best use of resources, including infrastructure, which is true. But at the same time, I think it's more about looking congestion, how this congestion, as what happened in the informal settlement, can contribute as well to spread of these diseases. And you can see those mega cities in Africa, which is the most populated and densified, and still the trend going on. Kinshasa, I mean, is one of that. Addis Ababa is now growing. Cairo, one of the mega city, and soon we'll have Dar es Salaam as well. So, which means that in terms of territorial balance and territorial planning, we need to see how to spread, this demographic dividend in the space to make sure we have a best use of those infrastructures, but also take into consideration those elements of health, but also and densification and connection and mobility. I think is a very key in terms of recovery from this COVID. Access to basic service, this is a very striking number, and I always, pull my ear when I see these figures, on the screen. 87% of population, still lacking, access to running water. I think this is quite a number. We need to look at, 69% and 69 million of population, have not access to running water in Africa. On the 21st century, it's quite, striking. So how we can fill this gap? I'm happy that the reflection and very critical reflection are going on now to see how it can help those communities to access to basic services, including water, sanitation, and energy, especially those communities living in informal settlement, which has, struggling, as mentioned by Leilani, for access to tenure security and access to decent housing and now water. And I think we need to really question a bit our engagement with those cities and those communities. For how many years we have been assisting those communities up to now. The gap in terms of access to basic services is huge. So poverty and inequality, of course, this COVID has increased inequalities, and we saw a lot of signal now all over the world, in many cities, in many countries, how people are really there of looking, for minimum revenue to support education, to support access to food, and we see the deficit we're going to see in the food system as well. Currently, UN Habitat and WFP are doing some analysis in sub-Saharan Africa on the impact of COVID, and I think in terms of food security, and the gap is huge, and we see the picture a bit bleak in terms of access to food in the coming years. But at the same time, those who lost their jobs, we are talking about 80% of African of working age, who lost their revenue system. And this number may increase if you do not fix the economy. I don't think right now the mood is about fixing the economy, because right now we are getting back to the third wave of infection, which means that we may again invest those extra revenue we get from banks and others into the vaccination system, which is not even accessible to many people in Africa. I think that's another area we need to look at in terms of equalities, how to make sure this vaccine is democratized and accessible to many communities in Africa. People are reaching, but just only drops is coming. And I think ICCCASU should look at this matter as well as factor of inequalities of division along the world, because we see Europe and others being reaching 80%, 40%, 60% of vaccination, while Africa is just 1% of vaccination. So I believe that, the world is safe only if everyone is safe. And also this linking to the housing element that you mentioned, Leilani, on your presentation, which is a factors of division now in Africa. Unfortunately, we have a surge of real estate developers controlling the market, while we have a bunch of people cannot even pay the rent. And we see a lot of eviction happening during this COVID-19, which is quite worrying. Also, those element of violation and violence against women that we experience in many countries, I think that's another dimension which is come on the top of the agenda, which come to informal settlement in terms of social protection and also social security. Consequence of this, of course, shrinking local fiscal space. And we see that I think if local government are really lucky, I think the fiscal will drop to 65%. and was 30% under the best case scenario. And today, I think it's more, we may go to more than that with the persisting crisis, and this shrinking of local fiscal has implication on service delivery as well for local government. Financial, economic and financial impact. Of course, some area much more affected are the manufacturing and service area, who have been absorbing a lot of use, a lot of employment. So now I think they are all suffering with this lack of speed of import and export as well. I mean, of course, Africa is moving through a new trade agreement, which is a good thing, but in the current context may be difficult to get the enabling environment for this border trade to be successful. So we see as well those cities and sample who decline from 3 to 4 in terms of financial impact. So as I mentioned it, one consequence is of this municipal revenue, which will go down, and which will lead as well to less financial resources to deliver urban basic services. Capital investment, of course, I think much affected are those less than 200,000 habitant cities. But also we know the capacity of investment of many cities in Africa are very small. Of course, right now there is more and more attention on secondary cities, but still the enabling environment need to be put in place, including policy, including access to land, including access to transport and connectivity of all those roads. And all these resources are used for the operation of public services, of course. So what UN Habitat has been doing, of course, as a leading agencies on cities, early stage UN Habitat has been very proactive in taking action in assisting cities in Africa and globally speaking by developing a strategy. And the strategy was articulating around 4 area. One was about looking to wash, but of course, if you have 54% of population living in informal settlement without water, sanitation, even to wash hands, there's quite a big concern of infection and a big concern as well of protected diseases and calamities on those particular areas. That's why the element of wash were very important. The second point was about data, because up to now, I think there's some gap on the number of casualty or the number of infection in Africa. But in terms of response to the COVID, especially those who are living in informal settlement, the element of data was key. And also capacity development, because we realized that, many elements of local government efficiencies was overlooked. We always invest in cities, municipalities, but capacity has been always low. And now if you really want to have a genuine recovery, urban recovery plan, we need to look at what kind of capacity do we need, especially with the emerging technology. We talk about, digital transformation. We talk about e-learning, we talk about e-governance. Those will require new skills, from local government and from authority. Special under standardization, I think this is something which is very important to take into consideration when it comes to COVID-19, how we reorganize our space now. If you look at this congestion happening in many parts in cities in Africa, I think looking at spatial dimension and spatial, planning is key in overcoming, the risk that those populations are facing in terms of disease spread, also in terms of getting into healthy environment. So we have been working in many countries. So our engagement could be articulated into 2. One, it was more about helping people to lessen the risk of the spread of the disease. And the second was more about now anticipating on the recovery phase. Even so, we are in the, still we have to deal with the disease in many cities right now is the second wave, but nothing prevent on anticipating, because we get a better understanding of the weakness of our cities in terms of health system, in terms of management system and others. So as you saw it in the screen, our work, has that more than 1 million beneficiary in sub-Saharan Africa. We work with this community to access to water and sanitation. You develop a system of cash transfer to allow communities, to get some money to start investing or even to pay for food. And also we develop a lot of tools for mapping and data collection on informal settlement. We start working on public space redesign to bring this element of nature-based solution. Waste management, I think we talk about this circular economy system, a way of engaging communities, but also a way of creating jobs for youth, but also guidance on public transport management, connectivity, not at the level of Toronto, but at least to make sure, the disease is not spreading through the transport system and allow connectivity. And what was important on this transport system is the fact that we promoted non-motorized transport system, which is healthiest, where people can walk, do exercise, but at the same time, enjoy, the fresh air outside with, less money. So, I mean, this is another area we are working now in Ethiopia on promoting, if you want, public space using nature-based solution. And now there's a big project going on now, over 52 kilometers of beautification of the Sugar project. And it is a way of diversifying as well, diversifying, access, different form of access to public space, and also building cohesive community, reducing spatial inequality, and building local economy, because we integrate the economic, social, and environmental dimension around this nature-based solution, where people are responsible and accountable of maintenance, but also in terms of improving health, increased job opportunity, but also reducing crime and social tension. This is just one example I want to share with you about this nature-based solution. Second element there where we are working now is the development of resilient plan for long-term recovery. So on this, there's some prerequisite. Of course, we need to have a multi-level, government system getting together, national, subnational, and local working together, because the crisis is not only local, because local central government as well has to support local government, especially on the fiscal package and all the capacity development and developing policy. So we are doing a lot of research as well on impact of COVID-19 related to education, and most importantly on housing, because we see this housing as a vector and has a potential as well for boosting the economic system, because I believe that, as mentioned by Leilani, this housing sector in Africa has not been tap on the potential level, because this housing can help create more jobs, create more opportunity to reduce social inequality. But unfortunately, we are still, relying on external material building, material construction. I know we are talking about China, but this is a reality as well. We need to see how we can find a balance between what needs to be manufactured outside and what needs to be bring on inside the country. But this is a potential area where we need really to invest in Africa as levers to really create more jobs and more revenue, including the taxation system, but most importantly, the affordability system. That's the reason why UN Habitat as well is working establishing what we call the Center of Housing Excellence in West Africa with UMOA, but also one element which is important in the process of developing our long-term recovery plan is the data, real-time data. And I think this is something which was missing on the housing level, but we need to systematize the data collection. We are doing as well some local economic analysis to identify levels of economic development. I just mentioned the housing one, but depending on the context of cities and on human settlement, we can have different levels, and those are different experiences depending on country. But most importantly, as well, the spatial analysis as well, which should come with all those dimensions, because without getting right the spatial analysis, we may not be able to get, a real and sustainable way of developing and managing our cities, especially when it comes to looking into distance and looking into as well the health dimension. This is just some element for the long-term recovery. But before as well, I think we have been engaged on knowledge building and policy analysis. And the report you are seeing on the screen was jointly developed with UNECA Africa, UCLG Africa, UNCDF, and Shelter. It was meant to drive and also to guide policy process, in a way that we're going to address the impact of COVID, but also to better understand the fragility of our cities in Africa. So I will just show you one recommendation of that report related to informal settlement, because there are more than that. But I think the informal settlement should be key top priority for African countries if you want to go into transformation of our cities, reduce inequalities, and make sure everybody has access to water and sanitation. So what is important for that for me is the design process, make sure everything is participatory, integrated, but also we have a planning approach and design the basic street layout to improve the connectivity with neighborhood, because they are all packed. There's no way you can move over there, and there's still a risk of infection. but also most importantly, to develop informal settlement regeneration and restructuring plan to be integrated in national priority and strategy to address root cause of vulnerability. As it has been said by other speakers on the table, vulnerability and inequality are very factors of, deprivation in many of this area. Another flagship program developed by UN Habitat recently, City and Pandemic. I think this was a quite great job that has been done in giving guidance on how this recovery should look like and what are the different parameters we need to take into consideration when we work with cities in developing recovery plan. And also on the preparation of this report, UN Habitat has established a city response tracker for deepening the analysis. And as you may see it on the screen, 1,700 analysis related to impact, response, and capacity, case studies from cities and countries as well, and also cities inside across all region. And we talk about 80 countries where we got feedback on this particular platform. So the recommendation of this report was articulating around 4 points, as you may see it in the screen, with the aim of establishing just healthy and green cities through rethinking the form and function of the cities, because of course we have some weak spot related to inadequate mobilities, housing condition, specific urban occupation, and all this can lead to spread of disease. That's the reason why unsustainable urbanization and linking with climate change is not something to really establish when it's come to this current context. But that's why we need to look at more equitable distribution and access to public good as well. It's very important to listen, vulnerability, but also most importantly, the planning form and design of our cities as a solution toward limiting air pollution, but also health distribution and accessibility of services. The second point, address systematic poverty and inequality in cities. I think here we need to look at the concept of right-based development, as mentioned by Leilani, to allow everyone to get access to basic services, to urban spaces, resources related to land, housing, water, and energy. And now we have all this digital divide, facing many cities in Africa. Rebuilding a new economy, urban economy, I think we have a new problematic that we are facing. Of course, we have an articulation between local, national, and national government working on that. But I think it's good to look at the social contract, articulated with this urban economy dimension. And when it comes to social contract, it's about, looking into basic income, health insurance, universal housing system, and most importantly, employment and economic growth, which is very important. Clarifying urban legislation and governance, I think, Leilani, you talk about that, the participation of citizens, and make sure we have a decent and sound, a governance system in place, especially access to information, but also access to the decision-making process. Without that, I think all this recovery plan we are talking about may not be owned by communities. They will be only paper as usual without any, concrete outcome on the ground. So this is just the last slide on the conclusion of the report. I think we have 4 big pillars, deriving from this report. And first of all is really the transformation potential of cities. As I mentioned in my presentation, this increased urbanization should be taken as an advantage and an opportunity, and not necessarily something bad. And that's the reason why we need to understand the importance of the national and local governance system as well articulated. The second one is we must elaborate on the pandemic, that understand that the trajectory of sustainable development is a well-planned and governed cities. And thirdly, we need an economic balance system of the health response to the long-term health and greenery of cities. And fourthly, we need to establish a new social contract for collective recovery, looking into various aspects of political spheres, which is a very important right-based response, looking into social protection, housing, income. And lastly, we need to review the crucial role of cities and the need of inclusive multilateralism. I think this 5 points is summarizing the whole discussion we are having within the framework of ICCCASU. And I raise the issue of vaccination, and we raise the issue of inequality, how multilateralism can help overcome those challenges we are facing. And I will recall the issue of climate change that has been mentioned by the mayor of Toronto. We see now all the world, struggling with the climate change element, not only Africa, not only Europe, not only America, not only China. So which means that we need to look at this multilateralism as a vehicle of getting a frank discussion and putting our mind together to see how we can build on those right-based approach that we talk about, and how we can drive this, human rights dimension toward inequal society, a more equal society, but also to help us, take lesson of the mistake from the past. Thank you very much, colleague, for listening to my presentation. I'll be happy to take any question you may have. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oumar, for your very comprehensive presentation and excellent talk with us. Thank you very much. Brief us the overall context in the African country, especially in the Sub-Sahara region, and highlight some development trends and gaps and opportunities in African country. I think I also encourage our colleagues, our participants to communicate with you for the further collaboration in some key areas in the future. Thank you very much accordingly. Okay, I would like to hand over the moderator to Ben for the
thank you,
further
Rong.
steps. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks so much. These were amazing presentations. I feel a little bit overwhelmed with the amount of information and the quality of the presentations. David Miller unfortunately had to leave us, so two of our panelists are here, Leilani and Oumar, and we are very happy to take any questions from our audience. Allan was on deck to pose the first question to David, but unfortunately David's now gone, so he's off the hook on that. One of the things I'd like to just start by observing the fact that we really looked at three things today: climate change, or this in the session, climate change, housing affordability, and the effect of the COVID pandemic. And what strikes me right off the bat is the fact that all three things affect all countries, rich or poor, in all regions of the world. Maybe not in exactly the same ways, but in almost equal proportion. Wealthy countries are struggling with housing affordability. I won't say just as much, certainly in different ways, but certainly we're struggling with it in Canada significantly, as are countries in Africa. COVID disproportionately affected the US, which is the world's richest country. So obviously the wealth of the country doesn't seem to have much effect on the overall impact of COVID in terms of people who have caught the disease or died from it. And thirdly, climate change is affecting us all across the world as well. So it's interesting that when we start this conversation focusing on three very different regions of the world, North America and Canada on one hand, Africa on the other, and Asia and China and Pacific on the third, we find that that these three issues are affecting them equally. So I noticed that Allan has a question for Leilani and Oumar. Allan, can I turn it over to you?
Thanks, Ben. In fact, I had questions for all three, but maybe the question of resilient cities that David raised. My concern was, as a urban planner, we've been working towards the densification of cities over the last number of years, and how does this jive with the challenge of social distancing? But let's park that. I discussed it in one of the other panel sessions. But for Leilani, I had a particular question related to, particularly to Africa, where probably less than 5% of housing is financialized through formal mortgages. Government subsidies that, at least in our experience in Angola and other African countries, are often captured by well-to-do classes and elites. Are there any good practice models for financing housing for the poor that could be appropriate for Africa and cities in the global south? I have another question for Oumar, but I can save that.
That's such a tough question, Alan. In terms of good practices, it's always a tough question where low-income communities are concerned. I will say a couple of things. I actually found myself strangely several years ago as a judge in a microcredit competition, microcredit financing competition that was related to housing. And I had never really turned my mind to microcredit with respect to housing and had many misgivings because, as many of you will know, the interest rate on microcredit loans is very high. And there are often there can be barriers to qualifying for microcredit that would disqualify, for example, people living in informal settlements who can't prove title to their lands. But as a result of being a judge in a competition, I was given some best practices. And in fact, the awardee was the group that got the gold or whatever, I think there were categories, was from Mexico. And it was an indigenous community that, and I loved the model because it wasn't a pure private model. It was a government private model. It was not a public-private partnership in that sense, so don't get me wrong. It was a lending scheme to a low-income indigenous community that had been living on the lands for a very long time, were very much threatened by resource extraction and the industries involved in resource extraction. And through a microcredit loan that was matched by the national level government, they were able to rebuild some of their houses and extend some of their housing on the land and invest in some agricultural machinery, etc., and thus able to withstand the pressure of the extractive industry, push back, and remain in their homes and on their lands. So that to me was a really super interesting model. It did require the government to step in. The government kind of backed the microcredit loans in a way, and there was a loosening of the restrictions. So land title became, could someone vouch for the families having lived on the lands for longer than 10 years or something like that. That's how they got around that. There were originally down payment requirements, like you needed to be able to show a certain amount of security through your own income, and they scrapped that and did it prospectively. So they said, well, we imagine that you will be able to, be sustainable through your agricultural endeavors, and so we'll waive that requirement as well. So it was a very particular project. It was very massaged for the particular community, but that, of course, why I supported it was because that is a human rights approach where you keep people in their homes and on their lands, and you figure out what are their particularities and how do we make this lending scheme work in their context. And so that's just one example. The other thing I will say is that I think governments have this sense that, especially in Africa, the global south, that there are all these informal settlements and all these people they need new housing. And of course, what should happen is the regularization of informal settlements and the upgrading of informal settlements in situ, no evictions, no forced evictions, et cetera. Those models, and we see that in Latin America to some degree, those models, I'm trying to think if I've seen that effectively in Africa, but there's others on the call. Oumar might have a better sense of where that's happening in a good way without displacement, forced eviction, et cetera. But it would be wrong for governments to think that they could provide mortgage schemes. Basically don't work for the lowest income households, period. I haven't seen one that is really tailored that works for the lowest income households. In Chile, they tried that, right? And it was actually a form of neoliberalism. And it was a disaster. They ended up, everyone is living on the periphery the cities of Santiago living in terrible housing, and they're left on their own because they were given these mortgages. And so then they have to somehow upgrade or keep up their housing, but they have such low incomes. It's been a colossal failure, really. And I haven't seen it successful anywhere that I know of for the lowest income people. So really what we need to be looking at is the upgrading in situ of informal settlements. It's very scary to me. I'll just say this, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals say that under target 11.1, so goal 11, target 11.1, that everyone should have access to adequate, affordable, secure housing, something like that. And what really worries me is that governments are feeling, and rightly so, that they don't have the resources to do this. And so they're bringing in the privates to do this. And in other areas, maybe it could work. In housing, we know it's a complete disaster because the privates are completely, not completely, but generally profit oriented. And so problematic. Sorry, long answer.
Thanks, Leilani. Let me refer a similar question to Oumar. Since the majority of urban dwellers in Africa are really owner builders, and this is a question that really relates back to Oumar's role, his previous role. We've been working together through the Global Land Tools Network for many years, and it's around the land issue. Should we articulate some of the new urban agenda, right to the city, really focused primarily on the right to secure land? Isn't that one of the, and for secure, I mean, secure land that is tenure secured, but also secure in terms of, well, civic security. So you didn't speak very much about the land issue in your presentation, Oumar. So this is an opportunity to put your previous hat on, and I'm sure you can reply to that question. And also, I know that the participatory slum upgrading program has been championing some good practice around slum upgrading as well, and could answer Leilani's question about positive examples in Africa. One of the things, though, around participatory slum upgrading or any kind of slum upgrading is that it doesn't necessarily address the rights of the renters, and a huge percentage of renters, a huge percentage of the poor living in slums are renters, and upgrading tends to benefit those, even slum landowners. So a right-based, a legal right-based framework needs to accompany a slum upgrading program. Anyway, over to Oumar.
Right, Allan, thank you very much. I'm very delighted that we are sharing this platform after all this, work we did together when I was in GL10. Yes, you're right. I did not talk a lot about land because I want to be balanced and to respect my new hat, not being biased. But of course, it's like you're reading my mind, because before even I start this call, I was in a long call with people from MCC, this American program. And the whole question was the place of land in economic development in Africa. And I think there's something which is clear. We will not win the battle of poverty if we do not address the issue of land, because land is underpinning a lot of things of people's life. Right now, you are talking about urban expansion, and expansion is happening on the land. If you do not have a sound land regime system, but also make sure you have a control land market. I think Leilani has talked about those speculation happening on the housing sector and the consequences on the land market, which is controlled, if you want, by cartels and big people, you know, detrimentally to communities. But unfortunately, I think you're familiar with the work of GLT, and we have been very courageous really to bring a new paradigm on the way of perceiving, you know, the issue of land governance in Africa. But I'm not sure if this thinking is shared by as many people. Most of the time, when you develop program and project, you start talking about landowners will tell you, oh, no, it's too complicated, it's too complex, don't touch about it. I think we need to break those, you know, those stereotypes around this concept of land and take it as an enabler and a driver for economic development and reducing inequality. Until we agree on that, we will be not able to see the best approach in terms of policy. I think we fail in Africa, in many countries, on our policy on land governance and administration by mimetism and by just copying and paste and not looking into the local dimension where we are operating. And this relates to informal settlement. Of course, when we talk about, you know, slum upgrading, it cannot be the one that has been done, you know, in Korea in certain years, because there's huge social dimension we need to consideration. How much the government can give social blanket to those communities. And also what is important, of course, as you mentioned it, on the slum upgrading process, the spatial dimension is very important, because you need to put road, you need to put, you know, place for big infrastructure and others. And all these elements are related to the land dimension as well. So meaning that I think in terms of the land issues, of course, it's fundamental if you want to succeed on using urbanization of leverage of economic development, and not as a leverage for creating more inequalities. We need to look at carefully the aspect of land, and you cannot do your planning of cities without getting right your land policy and getting right, you know, your land allocation system. This is clear, and I'm clear on that on all my speech. For me, for Africa to be able to get there, and to even the generation of revenue aspect. I've been explaining, you know, in 1 hour before on the conversation. Look at, for example, Kisumu counties, the on-source revenue. Right now, the county is just using 13%, 17% of the whole potential of revenue. So you have 87% of revenue now dormant somewhere, and most of them are related to land and taxation system. So we see those potential we have. And last time we've been making some provocation to say, why you go to IMF or World Bank to borrow money? Why are you sitting on gold, guys? What do we need to unlock those potential? I think those are some questions we need to discuss internally in the ICCCASU. What capacity do we need? What institutional framework do we need? What kind of policy do we need to unlock those potential? Because that's the way you can reduce inequality. It's not by aid. It's about creating revenue, locally speaking, and creating value in cities. And I think we all agree on that. Let's put the means and the capacity necessary and the policy, adequate policy to unlock those potential existing. I think so that's something which is related to the multilateralism we talk about, how you can borrow best experience, best practices from here and there. What are the good studies that have been successful? I think that, I don't know if I respond to your question, but those are some thinking. I know we know each other. We still have time to go through this debate. Over.
Thanks so much, Oumar. I don't have any other questions. I don't know if we have anything in the question and answer. I didn't see anything.
No, and I don't see any hands raised either, Allan. You know, I think the best thing to do at this point would be to say that this conversation will continue. It will continue over the course of this conference with the housing affordability panel tomorrow. There's a number of paper sessions on informal settlements and approaches to how we're dealing with them. And as I mentioned too, I think in our, one of the panel discussions includes Vikram Bhatt, who is a housing expert in Montreal, and our keynote session on Thursday includes Mario Pelez, who has extensive thoughts on how to address housing affordability in cities like Montreal. So this will definitely be a theme that continues to go. You know, I'm reminded I was fortunate enough to have 2 sets of thesis students that worked with Allan on looking at informal settlements in Angola. One group looked at ones in the central part of Angola. And even with the density of those informal settlements, we did find some vacant space. We could build some new housing at a slightly higher density and start to shift people really just a block away into new housing, and little by little redeveloped those. One of the other areas, the Onze de Novembre, for instance, had it had started as a formal settlement and then kind of tumbled into informality. And that meant that the rights of way for utilities were there already, and a kind of upgrading of that slum was more possible there. So I agree with Oumar. You really have to look at how the land is organized to determine what the best approach is, and then look at densities too to see how it goes. Leilani, you've got your hand up.
Thanks. I just wanted to pick up on something Allan had said, and I followed up on the chat a little bit, but around the legal protections for tenants living in informal settlements. I think that's such an important point. And I actually think there's a broader point to be made, which is the kind of selling out, leaving high and dry tenants around the world, actually, whether in informal settlements or even in formal rental accommodation. It has amazed me during this pandemic how tenants have often been left out of the equation, or these hot and cold approaches governments have taken in northern and western countries, a moratorium on evictions, and then they lift the moratorium on evictions, a rent freeze, and then it's not clear for how long the rent freeze, and the idea that, you know, there might be a rent abatement, but then you know, it's not clear for like whether the people will have to pay back the rent. Like the misunderstanding of the relationship between tenant precarity and homelessness, it's just mind-boggling to me. Like, rental accommodation, whether it's in an informal settlement or elsewhere, is the last stop before homelessness. And if you don't protect that, then what are we suggesting? What, as societies, what are governments suggesting? I find it mind-boggling, and I have to say that they're among the many, you know, campaigns and movements that we need. I really do feel that more. First of all, it's not even understood amongst you know, in international communities that residents of informal settlements are often tenants, right? As Allan had said, that they're paying rent often to slumlords in the very significant sense of that term. And so anyway, only to say that I feel a real urgency around this across the globe, because I'm not clear on how governments are expecting people to live if they don't want to protect tenants and protect, even if it's not the best housing, people need to be protected and not live in precarity. Anyway, that was my final comment. I actually have to dash. So okay. My sincere apologies that I'm commenting and dashing. Thank you so much for inviting me into this conversation, and I hope to continue it, including with Oumar. We've already exchanged emails, and so we will be continuing. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Leilani. There was one question for you that was just posted, but I think
okay.
We'll have to.
Let me just see if I can see it now.
Okay.
My question is: can the government be a part in the degradation of the human right by participating? Well, governments tend not to solve things, people solve things, right? So we know that, movements and people. So it is always up to us and what we demand and what we do to hold governments accountable. So I mean, governments are really meant to be responsive to people and their constituents, and so we have to keep people's movements going. That would be my short answer to that. And again, apologies, I have to run. I'm sure others have something to say about that question.
Well, we're actually at the end of our session here. So thank you very much, Leilani. Thank you so much, Oumar. These are fantastic and extremely informative talks. And as I said earlier, I think the nice thing is to understand that this conversation will continue in various ways over the course of the next couple of days. I thank you to my co-moderators, Allan and Rong. And we look forward to seeing you in other panels and other sessions over the course of the next few days. So with that, I'm going to call an end to the session and wish you all a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allan.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you,
Rong.
Alan. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Oumar. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Over to you, Hao Tian.